Ready to get started. Can you hear me back there fine? Good, glad to hear. Hi everyone, my name is Gabriela Lesquid, and you're here at Three Sides of the Same Coin, the medium, the mechanics, and the narrative is a message. What a confusing title. Let's unpack it together. My name, as I said, is Gabriela. My pronouns are they, she, and for any folks listening in later, to get a visual image, if you're visually impaired or blind, you have a person in a striped suit with purple hair, and it's a true marker of a video game dev. That's how you knew on the plane in you were in the right place. How many people had pink or purple hair? So welcome, everyone. So let's settle into what we're going to be covering today. Let's get a lay of the land, get it up front. Today, we're going to apply and explore media, game, social, and design theory to understand how we communicate meaning to players in unexpected ways. For those just coming in, I'll give you a moment. So as we begin, I'd like to ground us with a design thinking practice and principle, which is a how might we question. So as we go through today's talk, if you're taking notes or just in your mind, some quote I say really resonates, I want you to put in front of that statement or that sentence, how might we? How might I? How might my team? How might my classmates and I? How might I employ this or take this knowledge today, tomorrow, and use it in my work? So first we're going to do some brief introductions. Who is this purple-haired person standing here? Then we're going to go in some theories and paradigms. We're going to look at the messages inherent to the video game medium, and then look at messages communicated in interface, and rounding it out with a summary of some key takeaways and question and answer. So first, I want to see and poll the audience. How many here are students or early career devs? Okay, wow, a good amount of you. All right, so if you're early in your career, I just want to take a few moments to shed some light on how I got to where I'm standing today in front of you, just from the perspective to understand that each one of you will have a unique journey into games, and that uniqueness is an asset, and we should celebrate it. So this is my winding road into games. As a immigrant in America with family still in Croatia, liminality, being between spaces, human cultures have always been very important to me. So when I went to college, I studied the liberal arts. Those are the great books of Western and Eastern thought. I want to understand what made people tick across time, and that led me to anthropology and eventually to design. How can we take these fundamental parts of the human condition and make them accessible to people through visuals, like through 3D modeling in games, through graphic design, interface design, etc. From there, I went and I worked as a designer, a facilitator, and a front-end dev for the Department of Justice in the United States and other corporate clients. But I felt myself wanting more. I wanted to understand not only what my players or my users needed, but why. What are the inherent needs that lead us to any tool? And that can help us be better designers and better people. So I went and got a master's in applied social science in social work, understanding the importance for all of us as devs, but as people, for mental health and wellness, and looking specifically at narrative therapy. So what are the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves? And how might we re-author those stories to live a more holistic, positive life? How might we share stories to our community for community healing? And eventually found my way here in front of you as a narrative and game designer. Across all of these stops on the road, I was always playing games. I was always impressed by the potential for storytelling to make a positive impact on the world, and was able to do so in the indie space before coming now to Oxide Games and working on Aura History Untold, which is a historical grand strategy game coming out next month that really looks at the human experience. And so all of these stops along the way, although maybe confusing to you how, why, they all make sense to where I am now. And I'm grateful for every step on this winding path. Principles of social sciences can teach us a lot about how to be better devs, how to be better collaborators, better people. Understanding human cultures, where we've come from a philosophical standpoint over time, and then design thinking. How do I understand the needs before I design or develop a game, before I create anything? So the first takeaway here, especially for those of you who raised your hand, right? Every path to game design is unique, and every path is valuable. So I want you to think about, how might I take my unique approaches thus far in life as a student, as a dev, and use them to help make me a better designer, help me get into games, or just help me open my mind to what a career could be. And secondly, this is my personal opinion, and we'll see today if it's true, that principles of liberal arts, social sciences, and design can be very valuable in narrative and in games, and vice versa. Understanding interactivity, what draws people into games, can be things that you can employ to be a teacher, to work in a community setting, to design interfaces, and we'll talk all about this today. All right, introduction's done. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of today's talk: the medium, the message, and ludonarrative harmony. Theory, all of these fancy words that we're going to talk about today, exists to help make sense of what is and what isn't and what could be. So these are just a common lexicon that you can use going forward in your careers to tackle some of these concepts as you see them and encounter them in your day-to-day. So first, let's start with a term that might be one you've heard before. Who here has heard of ludonarrative dissonance? Okay, quite a few. So this will be just covering a topic you know. So this was coined by Clint Hocking in a blog post, I believe, in 2007. And ludonarrative dissonance is basically when the story told by the gameplay deviates from the story told by the explicit narrative elements, like cutscenes, spoken words, etc. And there are some games that have been levied with this criticism and have embraced it. So in Uncharted 4, you can actually earn a trophy called ludonarrative dissonance. So in Uncharted, you're a good guy doing good guy things, but that's in the cutscenes. Outside of the cutscenes, you might kill some people, and I believe 1,000 of those will lead you to get this trophy. But in social sciences, we have some evidence that looking at what we don't want isn't actually as effective as looking at what we do want. And this is an approach called appreciative inquiry in the social sciences. We want to investigate the best of what is in order to imagine what could be, and then collectively design a desired future together. And that is more inherently compelling than saying, don't do this. So what are we aiming for? We're looking for ludonarrative harmony. And that is the effective alliance, right? The reverse of the other term, of course. The alliance between... Something went wrong. Oh. Let's try again. Nice try, Siri. No, we're on the... See, Siri, appreciative inquiry. No, we're trying to do what's right. So what's right here is the effective alliance between gameplay and narrative to deliver a harmonious experience for the player. So this is a synchronized interaction between in-game actions, which we'll refer to as mechanics, and in-world context, which we'll refer to primarily as narrative or story in today's talk. So ideally, we want the narrative and the mechanics to work together. We want them to be so close that they're almost touching, that they're basically just a dope game where narrative and mechanics work as one. And this leads us to a dope game. And the random guy's face that you saw at the beginning of today's presentation. Who is this random guy? This random guy, well, I'll tell you in a bit, but he really would like us to pause and understand that outside of the narrative and mechanics is the medium itself. Before you write a story, before you think about, are we going to be a card game? Are we going to be an RPG? There is the medium of video games, and it's very important that we think about what the medium is telling us. So Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message. And today's talk, you'll see I changed that to say that the medium is a message. I would think it's important that we understand that narrative has a place, so do mechanics, but the medium is trying to communicate with us too. The way of describing this that McLuhan often used was to talk about a light bulb. Light bulbs do not have any explicit narrative content. They are what they are. But in their existence, the utility of these lights above our heads, there is an implicit message being communicated to us through the medium, which is there was once darkness and now there is light. From that we can see, from that our days can become longer. This is an implicit message to the medium of the light bulb, and there's no story in this. There's no ad, there's no mechanic, no narrative that we are telling with words. The light bulb delivers that for us. And so in that way, it's a perfect example because it has no content, but it communicates a social effect. McLuhan also was very cautious when talking about mediums and how they might be swaying us without us realizing it. And in his time, television was the primary example. He discussed how the way that moving pictures work, the television works, can lead one towards sensationalism, whereas the print requires that you slowly but surely read your way through the news story. One image or set of images can really get an emotional response out of people. And that can really be something that we don't think enough about. And I think all of us now, many decades after this was first published, see some of that, the sensationalism of media, of television, and of video games similarly. So a takeaway here is that mediums have their own inherent and implicit messages separate from the content. And it's important to think about, and we're going to explore together, what some of these implicit messages are. So we got pretty meta. Now let's apply it. What are some of the elements of the video game medium? First, there is this element of player interaction and input. In video games, the player is interacting with a medium. They are on a controller, on a mouse pad, on their phone. They're interacting with it. This is different than television. Tapping at the screen is not going to have any impact on what's happening. We also have the element of save, reload, and replay, which allows us to return. And then we have the varied impact on game state. Your player interaction, your player input is going to do something in the world, and that varies based on game. It varies based on the decisions made by the designer, but that is inherent to the medium itself. So if these are the elements of the video game medium, regardless of narrative or mechanics otherwise, what are some of the implicit messages here? Now, this is up to interpretation, but this is what I take away. With player interaction and input comes the message of control and mastery. I am holding the controller. We even call it that, right? I am in control. I'm making this happen. And our human imperfections and our desire to be better leads us to a narrative of mastery, seeking mastery over time. Save, load, and replay, death and resurrection. Yes, we have a nod up here. I might fail, but I can return and I can try again. And how great is that? I wish I could have done that on my physics tests in high school, but I could not. So we have this ability to fail and try again of death, rebirth, resurrection. And then finally, varied impact on game state. A hot topic I'm sure you're all aware of is generative AI. So maybe one day in the future, you can literally do anything at any time in a video game, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. So we have this idea that we are holding the literal controller. We are in control, and yet not totally. We can't make anything happen. We are within the limitations of the medium and the explicit mechanic choices of the game dev. And so here is the illusion of free will. In some essence, the illusion of choice. So all three of these messages, at least in my mind, are things that occur before narrative even takes place, before we choose what type of game mechanics we're going to have. There are undertones of these in all of them. And so I'd like us to explore some games where the contents of the game and the medium come to the head. So I'm going to be talking about the implicit messages of the medium as these three things here, and also going to bring us back to this concept of ludonarrative harmony and ludonarrative dissonance. So Destiny is a really interesting example. Who here is a Destiny player? No one. Oh, one hand in the back. Yes. I hope you liked the most recent content. But Destiny is a very interesting example because this save, load, death, and resurrection isn't dissonant to the narrative. In fact, it is the heart of the narrative. This idea that you are able to literally die and be resurrected, and what is going on and why do I have this power? It is the heart of the whole game, of the whole narrative, and many of the mechanics. So here we have a game where we are using narrative and the mechanics to further the message that is implicitly in the video game narrative. Hades is also a really cool game that does this, and my bias just came in. I think it's a cool game. You heard it here first. So Hades also, not spoilies, this happens immediately. You are in the underworld. So when you fail, you go down the river Styx and you start again, and people even talk to you about it. It's like, nice try that time. It's like, you really should have tried this. So here we have in the mechanics, in the narrative, an understanding that you are going to die, you're going to come back. Welcome back, buddy. Let's do this again. That is one way in which we see Hades embracing the implicit message of the medium. Something else that's very interesting within Hades too is the way that you evolve as a player is based on a narrative conceit of different boons you receive from the gods. Well, of course, this time you have this and this because you ran into Aphrodite and she gave you a love boon. Like, of course, that makes sense. So here we also see how the game is embracing that part of a common mechanic in a way that is narratively harmonious. All right, BioShock. As some of you who studied or know about ludonarrative dissonance, you know that the concept actually came from a discussion of BioShock itself. And so that was looking at the narrative and the mechanics, but let's look at the implicit message of the medium and what BioShock does here. So this has been out for a while, so I'm going to give you some light spoilers. If you don't want that, please cover your ears. In BioShock, yes, and cover your eyes, but that might not help. So here in the game, I think that there is some really interesting commentary on the illusion of free will. So spoiler alert, towards the end of the game comes the realization that every time you as a player have heard, "Would you kindly?" you really have not had a choice. And so this is one way in which BioShock is acknowledging and using narrative to further the implicit message of the video game medium, this illusion of free will, illusion of choice. Where we see BioShock starting to deviate from this message is later on in the game where they say, okay, yeah, but now you really can. Like, now you really have free will. But we, educated folk that we are, we know that this is a video game. We can't just do anything. And so we run into not only ludonarrative dissonance, but also dissonance with the implicit message and limitation of the medium. Has anyone played American Arcadia? Oh, yay. Okay, so I'm not going to spoil this too much other than this photo, but you can find this online. I think this is a really interesting game that we should all play that looks at the implicit limitations of the medium and uses ludonarrative dissonance to interesting effect. The whole time you're playing the game, you are controlling this character, but you are not this character. You're not this guy. Did you forget? On hour 2 or 3 of playing this platformer, did you forget you're not this guy? He didn't forget. And so at a pivotal point in the narrative, you're reminded that, oh yes, I am Gabriella. I am not this mustachioed man. And that is a very interesting reminder of this medium itself and this ability to fall into the illusion of control, of free will, of to believe yourself to be someone you're not, but you're not him. And so this dissonant moment that occurs later on in gameplay is actually teaching you a message about the medium. And then finally, very famous, the Stanley Parable, many a nod. Of course, you can't talk about this without the Stanley Parable, which really goes into 4D chess when looking into the implicit message of the medium. Do you have control? Kind of. What happens when you go against what the game is trying to tell you to do? And although we haven't gotten to the point of true generative AI, the Stanley Parable does its best to help us consider the limitations of control and give us more control. If you follow the narrator's path, that's kind of like playing any video game. But the ability to go against it is a commentary on the implicit message of the medium, that is control. That is death and resurrection. And that is finally the illusion of free will, the illusion of choice. What are we doing here? So a takeaway here is that the video game medium communicates meaning on its own. we have player input, we have save, reload, replay, and we have a varied impact on the game state. And you can think of more implicit messages there. How might you interpret these elements? And then another takeaway, narrative and mechanics can work together to create harmonious or dissonant experiences for the player, and this is separate from the medium itself. So we talked in a lot of these examples about save, load, and replay, and the illusion of control, but player interaction, not as much. And that's because player interaction is in everything. Input is in every single one of those games. So I'd like us to take a moment to acknowledge this and explore interfaces. They are an intermediary between the player and the video game medium, the mechanics, and the narrative. And they also have their own messages to share. Animal Crossing. Who played this in the pandemic? Yes, of course. Home away from home. So this is a very typical layout of a narrative interface. And I just want to introduce us to the elements. We're going to see some examples, and I'm going to ask for some audience participation. I hope that's okay, people in the back. So what we have here is very typical in narrative games or in narrative interfaces. We have Pashmina, who's chatting with us. Pashmina says, looks nice, don't it? And we can either be like, looks great, or be like, I don't know how to tell you this, Pashmina. It does not look great at all. So we have speaker, message, and then player interaction, player input. So there are a lot of things that we can do with how we design an interface that is communicating a message to the player before we even look at what the contents of those words are. Placement, top to bottom, left to right. Color, are we differentiating an option for one reason or another? Icons, very exciting, very heart. Text styling, bold, italicize. Styling, text sizing, small, big, and then fonts, sans serif, serif, etc. All of these communicate meaning to players. Happy, casual, fancy, less important, more important, pretty color, top left. All right, there are many messages here. So let's put this into practice. Let's look at one. Okay, hello, this is me. Doot, doot, doot. I'm now in a video game. I am asking you to make a choice. This is an option, so is this, and so is this. So let's look at the way that this is set up. What might we infer about the choices being presented here based on the layout? Yes, person in the back. Yeah, so there's a similar styling. So all of these have a gray background. None of them are bold or italicized, so there's consistency of styling. So what might we infer from that consistency? That you said that they're related? Yeah, that they're the same in some way, or they're not different from each other. Any other things that are happening here? Yes? Yes, similar importance. We can infer that. So another element here is we have them going top to bottom. Sometimes that can infer that, you know, the top one's the best, but in this case, we have a counter message in the fact that they're all styled the same. So I just want to get us primed, ready to go, because now we're gonna go into real world examples. Some of your favorite games, if you like RPGs. Let's start with Baldur's Gate 3. So some of you have already played, probably already have some ideas. So this is the full scene, and then I'm going to zoom us into the interface. But what might we infer? Wow, abs. What might we infer? Don't look here. About the choices, the narrative, and the game from this layout? Yes.
Well, because of the font and the styling, the italic ones, they show action versus non-italic ones show saying.
Yes. Yes, 100%. I'm just going to repeat it on the mic for the recording. So these are italicized here, and they're communicating actions to us. And this one here is not italicized, and it's a spoken word. Is there anything else styling-wise that's happening? Yes? So we have that top to bottom order happening. We also have numbering going on. There's one other thing here that's a little bit different. Yes?
The type of action
Yeah, the action versus spoken. So in this case, this is a little bit of a different color because it was hovered. It was in a hovered state. So but that's a good point, right? So here we have color letting the player know when their mouse has gone from one location to the other. I think yes, one last thing.
So the first word is an indication of what the parameters you need, or it is checking against this action.
Yeah.
The last answer is usually a way out of this particular.
That's great. And these are some things we can infer as gamers. But for like a first time player too, we're looking at this and we're like, okay, this, and this are different in some way. They have these brackets and this one doesn't have a bracket. So even in that, we can start to think, all right, there's something different about this last one. And there's something different about these top four. So when we have this order 1 to 5, there might be an implied hierarchy, but we also might have an indication of some of the places where this game is being played. So we're thinking as well about accessibility. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 means that this is easier for a player on the PC to go through and use hotkeys. So that's something else we want to think about when we're designing is what are the different consoles we're going to be playing or having players play on, and what are different ways we can make it more accessible for folks with different disabilities. And then the hierarchy as well, top to bottom, these are some actions, and this is getting your way out. We have these differentiated options. So if you're a BG3 player, you know that these are checks that are happening, but even the first time playing, you know that there's something happening here, constitution, performance, intimidation, etc. And you might be drawn to one of these words, and that might lead you to one thing or another. All right, another game, Dragon Age 2, who has played? It's been a while. Oh, yes, fellow fans. Okay, so what might we infer about the choices, the narrative, and the game from this layout? And again, this is indicating a hover state. Yeah.
It shows the emotion in which you're going to say.
So yeah, we have this icon in the middle. Is that where you're feeling the emotion? Yeah, so there's this, people might know, this is famous purple hawk. So yeah, there's this kind of semi-well-known symbol of the theater mask, which is indicating some type of emotionality or approach to the tone. What's happening here with the styling? Yeah. Yeah, so hierarchy is back here. So it can be confusing when we have hierarchy. And so in this case, we have the hover state here. So ordinarily, they would all be the same style, but in this case, we see on hover that this one is being considered. But hierarchy is an odd duck. So with this hierarchy, is anyone assuming who hasn't played that like, if they were all styled like this, would you assume that there's one that's better or worse than the other? Yeah, it's hard to tell. Hierarchy, again, what an interesting beast. So first, let's look at that. So the styling is uniform. All three of these, unlike in Baldur's Gate 3, there's no italicized, there is no bold. They're the same in this part. And what's happening here is that we can infer that they are potentially equal, but there is some range. And if you have played Dragon Age, any of the series, you will know this is BioWare's proprietary dialogue wheel. The top is often good guy, middle is sassy guy, and bottom is kind of aggressive guy. So they're not good or bad, but there is kind of a range that's being implied here. And then the icon implies flavor or uniqueness. So each one of these have their own icon and their own color associated with them that you can follow throughout your gameplay. All right, now we're going to bring an example from our upcoming game, Ara History Untold, and immediately it's different. You might infer that this is a completely different genre, and you would be right. So this is a historical grand strategy game where the other two were RPGs. So what might we infer about the choices, the narrative, or the game itself from this layout? Yes. Yes, yeah, and what's kind of telling you that? Ah.
Positive and negative implications of the color, the use of the plus and the minus signs, and then
Awesome. And I think that's an important thing to note here too, right? When we're thinking about what we're communicating to players, we're also communicating accessibility. So in this case, we have a negative thing being communicated both with a minus sign and with the color red, because some people have color blindness, red-green colorblind. So you want to be thoughtful whenever you're communicating something like that to do it in at least 2 different ways and not just with color. So here we have the indication that there is an outcome. This is on hover, so making it clear something's happening, what's going to happen, and is it a plus or a minus? Anything else kind of standing out to you here? Yeah.
Yeah, the text in gold look like they're, it's either another set or something like a mechanic. Like I assume grain store might be like some sort of mechanic.
Yeah, that's
Maybe you can tooltip those as well.
right. So these are actually tooltips. So these gold words here, if you hover over them, you can get more information. So what is the Briette's tribe? What is prestige? What is a grain store? So by hovering over these, you would get more information. Okay, so in this one, obviously we're in a different genre, so it's communicating a lot more information to the player. We have here same button styling, so all 3 of these with this is the hover state, but otherwise the narrative choice is in white, and then underneath it we have some color indications on the outcome. Relationship is important. So here we have at the top a relationship bar with the Briette's tribe, and for each one of these, I know it's kind of hard to see this far away, but this is indicating the impact on relationship. So you're kind of not in a great place. You might want to think about how much you care about your relationship when you're making your choice. And then finally here we have clear outcomes, which allow for quick decision making and accessibility. So in Ara History Untold, you can play multiplayer where you have a time limit. So in many parts of Baldur's Gate 3 and in Dragon Age 2, you can sit and think about it. But if you're playing multiplayer with like 50 of your closest strangers, you only have like 30 seconds. And so you need to put that information up front. You need to make it as easy as possible for the player to understand, if they are playing in a timed way, what they need to know, because you don't really have the luxury of time. So these are ways where you're designing, thinking about the type of genre, the game, and the player experience. So what can we take away from this? The interfaces we house our narratives within are also sending messages to the player. And player input, player action, interaction, this intermediary is very important as well. So let's go through some of the key takeaways and think about those how might we's. What have we covered? Every path to game design is unique and every path is valuable. You'll notice we talked about a lot of words today, and some of them you might have heard in your video game design education or in your passion for games, but some of them are new. Appreciative inquiry is a social concept in social work. It's a way, though, of understanding how we reach the goals that we want for our players. The medium is the message. McLuhan's work is in critical theory and media theory. Sometimes that's covered in game design courses, but sometimes it's not. So now you have these other ways of thinking, and that's partly because I had my own winding road to game design. The principles across these can be valuable in narrative and games. How might each of you, in your lived experience as individuals, in your various studies, in the things that you watch and read and do outside of games, how might those be applied to your work within the industry? Mediums have their own inherent and implicit messages that are separate from the content. So thinking about how you understand the video game medium, its own limitations, its own messages, and how you might create narratives that work against that for some type of impact or effect, making fun with the trophy, or in American Arcadia, taking a moment to break perhaps the immersion, to tell a message, to tell a story, or work in a harmonious fashion like we see in Destiny. The video game medium here, right, it has its own messages, and each one of you can think about what you take away from it. Narrative and mechanics can work together to create harmonious or dissonant experiences for the player. So of course we know ludonarrative dissonance, but thinking through appreciative inquiry, what is ludonarrative harmony? What is our goal? And let's work towards that. Finally, the interfaces we house our narratives within are sending messages to the player. We are telling players if something's good or bad. We are implying things with hierarchy, with styling, and also we may unintentionally be sending messages to players. If we're not thinking about accessibility, if we're not thinking about the different types of people who play our game, we might be telling people that they don't belong, or that they shouldn't be playing in the first place. And so this is my final takeaway for all of you. We can and will send messages we don't intend to. This is just the reality of being a human being in the world and having our own limited worldview. And so the final takeaway, the final approach comes from design thinking and from social work. When you are designing your games, developing your games, making a critical choice, it's important to ask who is not in the room right now who could be impacted by this decision. How might we bring these voices and perspectives into the conversation? With any type of game that you're designing, you want to think about accessibility. You want to think about the different people who are playing it all across the world. Within RPGs, you might be thinking of different backgrounds. You might want to think about sensitivity, bringing in a cultural sensitivity expert or a historian. But you also might just want to bring in an expert of UX and UI design if you happen to be a studio that has one person wearing 20 hats. So these are all the things you want to think about when you're making key decisions, is thinking about who's not there and how you might bring them in. There is always room to grow, and feedback only makes us better. All right, thank you all very much. Now I'm happy to open it up for questions. Do we have another microphone for question people? Anyone? Yeah, up front.
Yes, so thank you very much for the talk. It was very inspiring, and all the things you said really resonated with me, especially the part about the implicit messages of the video games. And I was wondering if you have games like Hades. I feel that the design of the video game with the rebirth theme is very close to the implicit messages of video games in itself. How would you go about having a video game with a story that feels very far away from these and trying to bring it closer to these implicit messages?
I think first you need to ask yourself what your goal is, because sometimes we have dissonance for good purpose. So first, understanding, am I being dissonant for a reason? Am I trying to communicate an impact or an effect? And that's something that happens in our American Arcadia. But if your goal is to have ludonarrative harmony, I think it's important to have people who haven't played the game before come in and watch them play and see where their immersion breaks. If you're seeking a certain goal, you want to try to see new players, see what the experience is through their eyes, and see where you see them maybe losing the mark if immersion is your goal. So watching new people play, asking them questions that are not leading. So what do you think about this? How was your experience? What parts were the most resonant for you? Opening it up so that you can hear their perspectives without leading them like, did you think? Et cetera, et cetera. So those are some ideas. Is that helpful? Yeah, great. I think I saw another hand in the back.
Hi. How do you decide which game mechanic do you include in the game's story world and which just stayed as a player tools? How do you decide which mechanic do you involve in the world?
So I think that ideally, right, if we're trying to get narrative and mechanics as close together, you want to, from the very beginning, have the whole team working together to think, what is the message that we want to communicate both through the narrative and the mechanics? So, for example, when designing the narrative event system for ARA, I had lots of ideas, I had lots of hopes, but the most important, and I love narrative, right? So if I could do it, it would be Baldur's Gate 3 or Dragon Age 2. But okay, how can I take my love of story and honor what we're trying to communicate, which is a historical strategy game where you can create your own history? And so the most important thing there is we bring those choices up to the front. We're not hiding the impact of the choice because we want you to have that full information because of the type of game we're playing. So I think when you're looking at mechanics, when you're designing systems, you want to look at what is the key message our game wants to communicate, and is this mechanic or is this narrative serving it, or is it working against it, and go from there.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other questions?
Hi, your talk was great. This might be a bit rambling, which is
Yeah, take us on the journey. We're here.
it's specifically the save load being a kind of core principle, because I was thinking of how that's been people play with that, like Undertale. I was thinking the ending of the Genocide run, and so I was kind of interested in like your reasoning behind that and whether you think that could be played with, or if there's a reason why you think that can't be removed as a core concept.
Yeah, I think replayability continues to be a concept in some way, but it's really cool to see games that play with save and load. But obviously, there's responsiveness that's happening in some of the examples you're talking about, where you leaving the game and going back is acknowledged by the game. Your attempt to save scum fails, and sometimes the game will actually respond to you. There are games like I Was a Teenage Exocolonist, which just assumes that you're going to die and that you're going to play again. So I think, to your point, save and load are more historical elements. We see them in most games, and that's why I brought that up. But the final dash or slash is that replayability. And that's something that I think is within the medium because it also, and this is important to acknowledge, serves the business interests of different companies. The ability for a game to be replayed is often to the benefit of the developer, depending on the type of game it is. So we can be innovating within the save and load space, but I think we'll continue to see replayability, if only because it serves capitalism. Yeah, thank you. Great question. Yeah, in the back.
Hello, thank you for your talk. Not so much a question. I want your opinion about this. I'd like to share the story. I really like to tell it about the director of Nier. But actually the game he made before he made Nier, he was basically, he was contracted to make a game called Drakengard. And it was one of those games where you have kill counters, like you shoot dozens of enemies and you have like, 1,000 kills popping up with flashy UI stuff.
Yeah.
And now if anyone played Nier or knows about the philosophy of these games, you know that that director, that he's also the writer, he's really taking things seriously when it comes to what things communicate. And he was bothered, like he was contracted to do this game, Drakengard, but he was bothered by the fact that you were supposed to play the hero, but you kill millions. Right. And it was this, I actually heard of the term first time now today, ludonarrative dissonance.
Yeah.
It was basically this phenomenon that led him to the creation of Nier, because he tried to write the main character in a way, from Drakengard, not from Nier, to seem like he goes crazy throughout his journey. Because you kill so much enemies and he goes more power hungry. But for some reason, the people still saw him as a hero after the release. And that really bothered him and brought him to the idea that he thought that why would people play a character that killed dozens of enemies? It doesn't make any sense. But then he realized it doesn't have to be a moral thing. Sometimes it's just if you believe that the main character is right or not, which is why he created the first Nier, where the main character always believes that he's right, but does something really bad, but I don't want to spoil it.
Right. No, I think there's so many really interesting elements there. The first, it's like in American Arcadia, we have this call out to the fact that you are not the player character. But oftentimes when we see ourselves as the player character, I think it just points to the flaws that many of us have, which is when we do something bad, it's fine. I mean, it shouldn't be, but oftentimes we're willing to excuse our own misdeeds or our own misbehavior, excuse it away more so than we are for others. And so I think there is inherently that coming forth in the discomfort that developer felt. They tried, and this is something else that you all have either experienced or will. Sometimes you come into a game later on, and you inherit either the narrative or the mechanics that have been there from the first place. And so if you're in charge of the mechanics, you'll do your best to use mechanics to work around any narrative gaps. If you're in charge of narratives, you'll use the narrative as best as you can, like this developer, to work around mechanic gaps that you see. But we can't do everything, and we can't solve all the problems that we have in one game. And so part of that is taking it forward. If something in a game you're working on or a game you play disquiets you, that's something to listen to. That's something to ask, how might I create a game that makes this more clear? How might I, in the future, in my work, right these wrongs? Or through my use of narrative mechanics and embracing or working against the implicit message of the medium, how might I tell the story that I want to tell and make people aware of things that we don't think are quite right? Like in this case, the hero being someone who slaughters many, many people. So I really love that example. I think it covers a lot of the different topics that we had today. So thank you. All right, I think we're done for today. Do we have time for one more question? Yeah. Thank you very much, Juniper.
Yeah, thank you very much. I especially liked your themes at the start. The first two were really resonated with me. The last one got me a little bit confused, which was the idea that the fact that you as a game, as a player, can sort of affect the outcome, sort of gets the theme of free will.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of games that have where I almost feel like there's a contract with the player, like let's say Tetris, for example, where I, as a player, am under no illusion of that there is any free will. I have a very good idea of what boundaries of the game I can push and what not, which is very different from Baldur's Gate, where I feel more like I could do anything.
Yeah, I think that actually had a conversation the other day about this. As we all have become accustomed to the video game medium, we also start to understand the contract that we're signing up for when we're entering a game. We are quite good scholars. Every single one of you, if you've played 2, 3, 5, 10 games, you already are a scholar in video games more so than someone when 1 or 2 games are available on the market. So we kind of enter into this implicit contract when we're entering the game. We understand this is the limit of the medium itself. But kind of like in the beginning of video, when they had the train moving and all the people in the theater ran away. Do you know the story? The first time that people saw a moving picture, they were like, this is a real train and I need to get out right now. I think you're pointing at the fact that we're all quite knowledgeable and we understand this contract that we're entering. Games like the Stanley Parable are ones that kind of push against that to make us realize, there are a lot of games where I just kind of assume what my limits are, and maybe I can push them. But I think it's the illusion of free will, the illusion of choice. If we suspend disbelief, if that's part of the contract, then it's not really an illusion against our will. But so great point, great question. Thank you everyone so much for coming today, and have a good DevCon, Gamescom.